boring well-being economy stuff that nobody wants to hear. So, but hi Rex, hi Scott, see you again.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, Dedicus.
Hey, Rex.
So who's got the hottest temperature here? How about we play that game while we're waiting for the next 60 seconds for everybody to log on? So Jennifer, do you think you've won this already?
I'm at 104 in Portland.
104, okay.
Portland. Oh.
Wow. No one else? No one wants to play?
It's
Well.
83 in Cupertino.
How hot?
83.
Oh my goodness.
Wonderful.
Hi
Chilly.
Laura, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
I'm sweltering. I'm sweltering at 72 in Hayward. So.
Me too.
I think we're at 99 today.
Wow.
99 in Pomona.
Wow. 102. Okay, you came in second place. Congratulations, I think, but maybe that's not exactly right. Anyway, I'm David Green, not related to Rex Green, although he and I do a lot of planning of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance California together. So thanks for coming. I'm sure more people will be dropping in, but I'm very excited that Jennifer and Anita are here to share more about their report and all the work they've done on this matter. We do have another event coming up July 23rd. It's more of a conversation. There's no presenter. It's just an interactive conversation about the Supreme Court and inequality and how does that factor in. So feel free to join us. I'll drop the link in the chat later. But for now, I want to introduce Anita, who seems to be having better internet connection. So
So good.
you just needed more people.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, hi, everyone. Thank you, David, for inviting Jennifer and myself to this conversation. We're going to eventually share slides, but before we do that, Jennifer and I wanted to introduce ourselves, and we certainly want to hear from each of you in all sorts of ways today. As David said, my name is Anita Chandra. I work at RAND. I'm actually based in Washington, D.C., so I probably would have won that temperature check a few hours ago, but it's now cooling off in terms of the evening. But as you may know, RAND is headquartered in Santa Monica, California, and has offices all across the U.S. And globally. I run a division called Social and Economic Wellbeing at RAND, where I oversee our work certainly on well-being, how we measure well-being, how we think about well-being, but also the intersecting topic areas like climate change and infrastructure policy, public safety and criminal justice, science and technology, health equity issues. So all of the kind of dimensions of well-being we also cover at RAND.
29.
So I'm going to just turn it over to Jennifer to introduce herself, and then we can get started.
Thanks, Anita. Hi, everybody. David, thanks for bringing us into the conversation. I'm Jennifer Messenger. I'm with Metropolitan Group. We're a social impact communication and strategy firm. I'm in Portland, Oregon, and I lead our public health practice. We also work in environment and sustainability and in social justice, and well-being sits nicely across the intersection of all of those areas. Our work is with foundations, nonprofits, and public agencies. And so in the public health work, which is where our well-being work sits across the country and in other countries around the world, we've incorporated well-being thinking, both direct well-being narratives and also how we can use well-being conversations and narratives as a lever for democracy change, for public health policy change, and for economic justice, among other issues. So we'll share more about that as we go today.
Great. Thanks, Jennifer. So while Jennifer is getting the slides shared on the screen, we just kind of put a little icebreaker in the chat if folks are so inclined to answer it, introducing yourself to each other, but also a question that we often ask, which is, what is giving you oxygen today? In short, maybe what's fueling you and giving you some joy today, or at least in the last couple of days. And if you want to throw that in the chat, just to kind of get into the sense of the well-being conversation, we wanted to kickstart a little bit of that spirit in today's discussion. As Jennifer shared, we're going to be basically referring to a guide that we created between Metropolitan Group and RAND called Advancing a Wellbeing Narrative. That was linked in your invite, and we'll put the link in the chat. It's actually a part 2 of a 2-part guide series, which kind of walks people through how to advance and think about a well-being narrative and some of the nuts and bolts of well-being narrative strategy, which we'll cover a little bit today. But we're also really going to try and have some interactive discussion. We do encourage you to put some questions or comments at any time in the chat. Try and grab those if you want to raise your hand. Both Jennifer and myself, as well as I'm sure David, will be monitoring so that we can keep this as lively as possible. If you can go to the next slide, Jennifer. So our objective is really quite simple. We have an hour together, but we hope this is the start of a conversation and a discussion with all of you as we work in partnership with the efforts that you have locally in California, as we do with other communities across the country. We use this as an opportunity to think about how sectors are working together and really disbanding silos when it comes to the conversation of advancing well-being. We want to talk about really what do we mean by centering in well-being and what that looks like when we do narrative work. And of course, keep it lively, try out some different strategies, some different ways of thinking, depending on sectors that you might be working in or sectors that you're trying to move along or convince or have them pivot towards a greater appreciation of why well-being matters so much. So we're going to walk through some of the kind of critical ideas that came from work that we've done on the issue of well-being narratives, which Jennifer will start us walking through. Some of this is summarized in that Advancing Wellbeing Narrative Guide. So if you're interested in more of the research behind it, some of the work that we did with organizations and with communities, testing messages and all that, it's all contained in that guide and its predecessor guide, and freely downloadable and shareable. We'll do a little bit of kind of play and practice. So around the half point, we will do some breakout discussions where we split you up by sector to talk about, different ways that different parts of our community network might be talking about well-being narrative or coming to the conversation about well-being. And then we want to leave certainly some time for discussing, bringing back together those ideas and hopefully jump-starting a way of thinking that you can take back to your organizations in your communities using the exercises, using some of the tips and strategies in those guides. So I'll turn it over to Jennifer.
Thanks, Anita. I want to do just a quick level set on narrative and narrative change. Those are words that are gaining a lot of traction over the past few years, and I think it's always helpful just to set a shared definition. So when we think about narrative, we think of a narrative being a general story that people collectively hold about why the world works the way it does. And that narrative is made up of a bunch of different elements. And so as we're thinking about understanding existing narratives and amplifying some of those narratives or bringing new narratives into that conversation, we think about the component parts of a narrative. So what you're seeing here is what we call the narrative tree. And the frame or the roots that we think about are really deep values. So when a narrative gets built, at its heart or its roots are the values that it's built on. And so in the case of well-being, you're going to hear us talk about hope, collective outcomes, human dignity, things like that, that would really anchor something in well-being. Also built into that frame is some idea of what's happening and what the cause of that and what a solution to that might be. So what's happening? How do I get involved in that? What do I do about that? That's all part of something that we hold in narratives, whether we think they're fixed or whether we think they're changeable. That's all part of that frame. The trunk then of the narrative tree are the messages, like the main ideas that sit within that narrative that we hold. And then flowering from that are all the different stories. And I don't just mean a story like a book or I'm going to tell it to you. It's all the stories that we experience. So it might be something my grandmother told me. It might be a statue that I see in my town. It might be movies or TV or the news media, or what I'm reading or stories that I'm getting, right? Anything that's shaping this narrative, this explanation of how the world works to me. And that all gets filtered or makes me more receptive or resilient based on the echo chambers that I live in and my lived experiences and the culture that I'm part of. So that's how we think of narrative. And we think of narrative as a really, really critical piece of social change, because the narratives that we hold predispose us to thinking about what's possible or what's not possible. And we're going to talk way more about that as we get into the well-being narrative. I'm going to drop into the chat just a little bit more background on narrative. There's a little video in the clip that I sent you that just gives a little bit more detail about what I just said about narrative. Oops. So then thinking about the well-being narrative, Anita and I came into this work through a couple of different cycles of research and exploration with Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and other organizations about the idea of well-being and what you all are doing, creating just economy, shared economy, well-being economy. We wanted to even understand how would we go beyond that and even have well-being be the thing that we're centering on? What if well-being were the thing that we were aiming for when we made any decisions or set a budget or voted or did anything, right? So the assumption, our hypothesis that we were coming in with was the dominant cultural narrative in the United States and in a lot of Western nations is that progress is economic growth and consumption. Like we will be doing better as individuals, communities, a country when we have more stuff, we make more money, GDP is stronger. That's how we will know that we're making it, right? And that narrative leads to really, really harmful decisions, right? Like if we're looking to grow our economy, things like prisons and wars and gas guzzling cars can be really awesome for the economy and really terrible for humans and the planet. But that, as long as that narrative holds, anytime we get to the crux of a vital decision, it's what's the impact on the economy, right? Just think about COVID. COVID came in the middle of all of this research, and I was so heartened at the beginning because the narrative seemed to be like, okay, wait, we can put everything else on hold. Health is what matters. Keeping people connected and together is what matters. And after a while, it was like, yeah, the economy's not doing well. Forget everything. We're back to business as usual, right? That is such a strong, dominant narrative in the United States. It's very individually focused in every way, right? Like I want to get ahead. I want my country to be the best. I don't care who I have to walk across to get there. Like that is my vision. It's very, very individual in what we expect of ourselves and what we expect of other people. The whole pull yourself up by your bootstraps narrative is baked into this individual narrative. So on the flip side of that, in the green, we really believe that there's huge opportunity to shift the way decisions are made by broadening that narrative of progress to encompass holistic well-being. Now, that includes a sustainable and equitable economy. As long as we live in capitalism, we have an economy and it needs to include everybody. And it also includes physical and mental health, social connection and purpose, a thriving planet and ecosystem, all the things people need to create the lives and the futures they want. That's what we're thinking about in terms of well-being. That is a very collective focus. There's an individual element in it, but it's way more collective in focus. And Anita's going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. I want to show you just a little bit about how we got here, and you'll see more about this in the guide. I dropped that link in the chat earlier to the guide, and I'll put it in a little bit too, just so you have it handy. But we had done some research looking at countries around the world, England, New Zealand, Mexico, that were in various stages of moving toward a well-being approach. New Zealand had a well-being focus in the treasury. It had set a well-being budget. England and Mexico were in various stages of that. And what we wanted to understand was there a shift in narrative that made those well-being policies and budgets and other actions possible, and or did those shifts create a new narrative in those countries about what matters and how we make decisions? Coming out of that research, we came up with three different stripes, if you will, of narrative. One was this traditional economic growth consumption narrative. And the other pole was what we were calling the well-being narrative. And what we really found in the middle was what we called economy plus. And it was where a lot of the well-being economy narrative work seemed to be going. Like it still was very grounded in the economy. And our hypothesis was that as long as we keep talking about the economy, because what the economy means, the narrative that we hold about the economy is about growth and consumption, unbridled. And so if we can't get out of that narrative, we're still stuck. So we want to go all the way to well-being. So we took that global research, we worked with birth equity and climate justice leaders in the United States at the grassroots level, and we played with this narrative with them. We then talked to well-being advocates in the United States, and we played with this narrative with them. And then we tested it with policymakers and business decision leaders to see, how does this play with them? How do we get this across? Does this resonate? And that's the refined narrative that is in the guide right now. We're playing with it in our work, and Anita's playing with it in her work. There's a whole collaboration of folks in various places across the US and in other places playing with this narrative, and we're really excited to share it with you today to play. I talked about values being at the root of our narrative. And so in our research, we really wanted to understand what are the values that drive a well-being narrative, that anchor a well-being narrative. So you'll see on the left, when we talked with grassroots and well-being leaders in the United States, what they really held deeply as values that drive the way they're making decisions and they want our country to make decisions. What rose to the top were dignity, innovation, self-determination, and interconnection. When we talk to policy and decision makers, the values they hold in making their decisions are common sense, fairness, compassion, social responsibility, and freedom. Now, those are all values that we can look at through many different prisms, depending on other narratives and mindsets and worldviews and cultures we hold, right? And so especially with an elected official, a progressive decision maker who says they value freedom might define that really differently than a conservative decision maker who says they value freedom. So all these values have different facets and colors in them, but that's where people were really anchoring. What we found in that middle sphere is where there was a lot of shared energy, health, connection, purpose, and peace. So that's where we leaned in thinking about the well-being narrative, is on those shared values that sat at the core of all of those different parties who we were talking to. So the core narrative that we came out is this. This is the narrative that we wish to be true, or we think this is a true narrative. This is the narrative we wish to become dominant. Our culture prioritizes well-being as the ultimate indicator of progress. We make decisions based on their impact on well-being. One great thing is we found that that term, well-being, was pretty well understood in the way we intend it to be. One of the conversations we've had over time is, oh, when we say well-being, do people think we mean yoga or mental health or like yes and lots more, right? And the folks we talked to really understood the yes and lots more piece of it. So that word really held, and this idea really held. The trunk, those influential message points that make up the narrative, are here. So well-being, we can increase dignity, purpose, connection, and productivity. Hold on, let me find these and read them to you for real. Increasing individual and community well-being can increase dignity, purpose, connection, and productivity. One of the talking points that fit with that tested really well was, these days, people feel increasingly disconnected from one another, their community, and their country, which leads to disunity and harms people, family, and communities. I mean, that we wrote 3 or 4 years ago, and it still feels so resonant, and people really resonated with that and wanting to come back to that dignity, purpose, connection, productivity of a well-being narrative. When the community helps to set priorities for achieving individual and community well-being, there is a greater sense of belonging, purpose, and connection for all. This is one of the most democratic ways to make decisions. And when we focus on well-being, growth becomes sustainable and creates opportunities for more people. So those are, again, those key message points, the trunk of the narrative tree. The guide also gives you some supporting message points. Let me read those to you, and then again, you'll find them in the guide. Well-being is by nature collective, considering relationships among people, interconnectivity of cultures and societies, and relationships between people and the planet. That piece held, again, among all the different folks that we talked to in this creation and research. To understand whether individuals and communities have well-being, we have to look at combined data about health, education, jobs, and other factors, and we have to ask people how they're doing. Some of the work in well-being that many of you may be doing is really focused on the data piece of it. Like, how do we define well-being? How will we know if we have it? What are all the different data indicators? And so we wanted to be sure to talk about that, and especially the piece of the data that says communities need to be integrally involved in defining well-being and in measuring well-being and reporting on whether they are feeling well-being subjectively, not just objective measures. So we blended that into our conversation. And then finally, advancing shared well-being is in the domain of both public and private sectors. And again, that was something when we talked to those business leaders and electeds, they really understood that, like, this has to be shared. This isn't just one responsibility or another. Anita, let's talk a little bit more about collective.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. So as you heard from Jennifer and some of the key points from the Advancing Wellbeing Narrative Guide, where we talk about the sort of notions of interconnection and collective and implicitly, if not explicitly, embedded in well-being. One of the things that we wanted to underscore in today's conversation is part of a national discourse around how we orient to the conversation of well-being. Many of you are probably very familiar with the work of large survey houses that have been tracking how individuals view their future, their outlook, their sense of hope, their sense of optimism. We often call that individual well-being and subjective well-being, and that's critically important. We also have increasingly at the community level been tracking what we might call community and or civic well-being, the status, the amenities, the conditions, economic, social, political, and otherwise that give people the best opportunity to thrive and flourish. Both of those things are critically important, both in terms of measurement and how we act upon that information for policy. Also critical for narrative. It matters how people feel about their futures, and it also matters their community conditions. But one of the things that has been kind of primacy in the conversation of late in the US, but really bringing in global conversations and multicultural perspectives in the US, is that we're missing a very significant component of the well-being conversation. That is this notion of collective well-being, which people sometimes nod to, but actually don't articulate, don't operationalize, don't measure. We just came back from doing some workshops in communities across the country, really working with communities to say, what do you have in your community? What do you know about your community's collective well-being? And people found that to be important, but a big gap area. So the way that we think about collective well-being, and then sort of the working definition, just to give you a sense of things, and build on the points that Jennifer was talking about, is that unlike individual and community well-being, collective well-being focuses on the interconnection between human and place well-being, so that environment and natural ecosystem, but also how people experience place based on factors such as history, collective joy, and collective trauma. It also speaks to the ties between people and people, people and places, and people and institutions. So it's much more of a relational and network way of thinking about well-being, which for some communities and populations in the US is not a novel concept. They are already there, where they're less egocentric in the way that they think about well-being and much more networked or sociocentric. But the dominant narrative in the US has been, if anything is on well-being, it's mostly very individualistic. Collective well-being also really focuses on systems and how do we measure systems that advance well-being, and the connection of systems that foster things like economic inclusion with those that support health. So how do we connect the dots across systems? And the other kind of hallmark of collective well-being that has been differentiating and is kind of leading the conversation today in the US discussion is this idea of intergenerationality and how we think about well-being. So the choices and investments a community or a nation makes to benefit groups and populations, particularly with that idea of a future generations focus. So in the US, we might talk about the social contract or multi-generationality. In places like Wales and the UK, they have something called the Future Generations Act, where policies are viewed through the filter of its impact, not just in short, but long-term. Jennifer and I are part of a meeting where we talked a lot about what the sort of notion of ancestry in well-being. So this is where collective well-being fundamentally sits. And the idea of collective well-being also is that it takes more of that ecological view that I was mentioning. It doesn't just have individuals as the unit of analysis, if you will, both in narrative and measurement, but really the family, the household, and the community. And it also allows for a greater centering of equity. So as we think about kind of not only how we go about policy work and measurement work, which is also part of this conversation more broadly, thinking about how narrative affirm and tell the story of these interconnections, of these choices, investments, of this future generations focus is something that we want you to hold in terms of this conversation today. And also as we go into a little bit of an exercise, think about the extent to which some of even the narratives that you might have been advancing on well-being still may have been very traditional or dominant or individually based. As opposed to really exploiting and leveraging this idea of networked or relational or collective well-being. Next slide. So we're gonna kind of split you up, which I think David has you shortly randomly assigned to one of three small groups. We will show you some screenshots on the next couple slides from the guide, but you're more than welcome to pull up the link to the guide and open that in your small group. And there are several sectors discussed in the guide, but we decided today that we were going to ask you, you to think about three particular groups. One is business leaders. Another one is the media. That can be the traditional media, but obviously we have a proliferation of all types of media, so you can be creative with it. And then a third group is policymakers. That can be local policymakers, state policymakers, policy sort of influencers, decision makers. And we want you to think a little bit about how you would make your case using a well-being narrative to get any of the members of that stakeholder or participant or constituent group to think more deeply about why it would be important for them to advance this idea of well-being. This importance of this well-being centric orientation to their role in the conversation. And we're gonna kind of have you think a little bit about some of those narrative and messages that Jennifer talked about earlier, the connection, the purpose, the peace, and the health elements, as well as some of the tips that we have in the guide. So if you can go to the next slide, we can just kind of revisit some of these critical points. So on the left, and this is also in your guide, I think on page 12, Jennifer can correct me, this is the Venn diagram that she walked through, and this idea of where did we find points of complementarity, synergy, were in notions around health, connection, and peace. We also talked a little bit about these influential messages. When we focus on well-being, growth becomes sustainable, increasing both individual and community well-being can increase dignity. You also heard me talk about the idea of the interconnections mattering. And you saw that in COVID, but certainly past COVID, where if we only know how individuals are doing in community, we still don't know collectively our ability to move change, our ability to come together to solve problems. So trying to think about why that narrative really matters. And then the idea of, being much more well-being centric in terms of thriving and flourishing, the benefits to humanity and the planet, as opposed to kind of that economy plus idea. So those are the kinds of ideas that we're hoping that you'll play with in kind of about 15 minutes in your small group, and then we'll come back together. If you go to the next slide. So these are some excerpts from each of the audience pages. So for public policy decision makers, we want you to think a little bit about if you were trying to move along a policy audience and get them to think a little bit about why it would be important, for example, to broaden the way that those policymakers measure and track notions like collective well-being. What would be important for policymakers to maybe center in their policy decision-making? What would be important for policymakers to think about as they're drafting legislation or other kinds of policy documents? So consider some of these ideas, but in the context of public policy, both decision makers and all the people who are around public policy decision makers, influencers and the like. So one group will kind of play with this idea of trying to move this audience to be much more embracing of a well-being narrative. The second group, next slide, will be focused, I believe, on this slide shows the media as well as business. So for media, one of the things that we talk about is what could media do to affirm messages, stories, features, norm.
Oh, I think we might have lost Anita, or have you lost me? Am I frozen too?
No, it's more on Anita's side, yeah.
Okay, okay. So, thinking about,
Values, perspectives that talk about the importance of
I'll let Anita know she's coming in and out. Maybe Jennifer, you wanna,
I was just chatting her too, David.
okay.
I want to come also, Indy, I see your question in the chat, so I want to circle back around to that too before we go. But what Anita's setting up on this slide is just these two other groups that will work on, if you're working with the news media, how would you start to tell stories differently to center those values around a well-being narrative? I'm actually working on a pitch actually to do a project to work with reporters to look at the way they're reporting on the economy. And what I want to say is every time you talk about the economy and you give the same old numbers that you give that are all about GDP and job starts and the stock market and all of that stuff, like, is there something else you could bake into it that would give a bigger idea of what actually matters, right? So I heard something on NPR the other day, and they said, oh, housing starts are up, blah, blah, blah. And a third of those are for first-time home buyers. And I was like, that was a great little added twist that gives me more context about what housing starts even means and who's buying those. And so looking for opportunities like that is something that you might play with the news media. And then there'll be another group that's thinking about business decision makers, including employers in your community. And if you're talking to them and introducing the idea of well-being, how might you invite them to base decisions that they're making and policies that they're setting on the impact of well-being? Some companies are part of, might know B Corp or called triple bottom line companies, and this idea might be more familiar to them. But as you're talking to employers in your communities in general, thinking about ways to get them to think about this broader notion of well-being as part of how they're making decisions and setting their definition of progress. So we put these 3 pages up just so you could see them and screenshot them if you wanted to. Again, they're also directly in the guide that I've been linking in the chat. And we just wanted you to have this handy as you're going into small groups. I'm going to stop sharing for a second. And I was going to look and see if we have Anita. You're back.
I'm back. Sorry about that. I apologize. I thought it might happen, but I don't know if we had any questions before we move people into breakouts.
We did, Anita. And Indy, do you want to say your question? I'm reading it in the chat, but do you, oh, wait, now I don't see you. You have stepped away. Here's the question. Can we have any real collective well-being if the diseases are not reckoned with, like distrust, corruption, fear, etc.?
Yeah, so the argument about collective well-being is actually this idea that people are building the kind of the muscle and the collective will that communities can work together to address systemic harms and build a future. So that's where the difference is with this sort of notion of individual or community well-being, which are all like laudable ideas, but they don't necessarily get underneath the hood. So there's a very systemic orientation to the idea of collective well-being that doesn't paper over that. Doesn't mean that it's easy, of course. But that is kind of baked into this this notion and this framework. And so how are we in narrative stepping people through a process of how they come to understand those concerns and want to work on those concerns? And as Jennifer was talking about with the tree visual, right, trying to shift and pivot people's frames takes some steps, right? You might be working off of somebody's notion of fairness, stepping them through the idea of fairness and working through biases, perspectives, history, culture, and values, and then moving them along and shifting a frame or repackaging the frame. That's why narrative work is so deeply challenging, but critically important. It's not a messaging campaign. It's not a comm strategy. It goes to the root of where what people believe about themselves and then starting there actually to use that to pivot. And we've done this in some communities where we've actually taken people's values around pride or Americanisms and all of that and start to use that as actually the entry point into a conversation about well-being. And that kind of, it's not easy, but helps to start to have a different conversation than certainly our political landscape suggests.
I have two questions before we start the breakout room. First one is, could you just maybe restate again what you're hoping people will do once they're in the breakout room? What I'm assuming is you want them to discuss, if you're focusing on the sector for the group that they're in, what are the different narrative devices they would use? And the second question is, should I reduce the breakout rooms to 10 minutes considering the time that we're at? Jennifer?
Yeah, so what we're
I don't
inviting
want to
you
give
to,
a short.
if it feels useful, the idea was that you would, in those different sectors, think about, okay, with this well-being and merit narrative in mind, as I'm working with these folks, where am I getting stuck in shifting their overall idea of what progress is to this broader well-being narrative? And can I pull any of these narrative tips and tools and messages into that to try to move us to a different place? So for example, the example I gave you with media, if I'm working with news media and they just keep reporting on the stock market all the time, which is reinforcing this narrative about growth and consumption, what might I say differently, right? Or if businesses in my community are like, yeah, I really like that well-being stuff, but you got to understand, I got to make money here. Everything's different since COVID. Like, what might I do to pull them in a different direction to think a little bit more about collective well-being, holistic well-being, like any of the tips in this helping you? And David, in terms of timing, yes, I think we can shorten the groups. We can keep the groups as we are and shorten our time when we come back together. And I kind of defer to all of you and the culture that you have. Like, if it feels more productive to stay here and just talk about this and do some what ifs and hypotheses, that's totally cool too, whatever works for this group.
I think if people generally enjoy having more space to talk without having to be so public. And just for reference, if you're in Jennifer's group, it's media. If you're in Anita's group, it's the public sector. And if you're in my group, it'll be business. And then we can come back and share. So it'll still be opportunity for both. Great.
Great.
Whoops, I will shut off the.
What does this mean? That
Welcome back.
Back, I know. Sorry, you're making good points. Cut off mid comment, but yeah. I don't know if we want to go around, talk from each of the groups, or maybe we can start with Paul, or Indy was like making a point, maybe wants to make it with a broader group, but I'm sure the other two groups also want to share. So we can, does the policymaker group want to go first so we can just finish Indy's thought, or, and then we can go to business and media?
I'll never say no to taking up space.
Okay, well, maybe if you want to just share a little bit of what you have learned through your podcast, I think it's relevant actually across sectors. So
yeah, just a feeling, one, from the perspective of policymakers, that they're more and more burned out, disconnected from their purpose and why they got into the business of being a public servant. And a lot of that happens because of the us and them that happens within communities, and a distrust and a disconnection. And so even as we're doing any of this work and, you know, sharing some of the work that everyone's doing, I wonder like how important it is to first develop spiritual glue and spiritual connection, and before even the policies, before the facts, before the blah blah blah, is actually just building more of that connection. And then I also wanted to throw in there that what I've noticed is a lot of policymakers that I've spoken to who are really good people, they don't practice meditation. They don't practice tools for improving their transcendental thinking. And that's actually a scientific word, transcendental thinking. That's when we start using our imagination. and we problem solve, right? And if you're in fight or flight, if you're in cognitive thinking only all the time, you're not really applying the part that makes us amazingly human and altruistic and collaborative and cooperative. And so I wonder what would happen if we cultivate more practice of transcendental I mean, I hate that word because that's kind of like a cult now, right? But like more meditation and more just coming together and having those contemplative moments for policymakers, and all of us actually, to sit actually and imagine and actually practice imagination, because you can't even get anywhere if you don't actually have a deep practice of imagination. So anyway, just throwing that out there, I just witnessed that problem with policymakers is that they like hit a wall when you start presenting them with things that they don't even, it's not even in their world, right? Like, but it's things that are great inventions or great possibilities, but they just don't have a practice of imagination.
100%, 100%. And I was thinking about when you were saying that in the research, I was just going back through the guide, because one of the things that came up in some of the conversations with policy influencers was their own understanding of their own well-being and how that compares with the well-being of their community. And then their own even awareness, like awareness of life and awareness of feeling and awareness of mindful emotion and all of that stuff. So I think that's right. And maybe there's a place to, I mean, I'm sure you all are doing this. Like, how do you lean in on policy and business decision makers who are more there? Like, can they be some of our forerunners in really carrying the well-being narrative more broadly within the business community or the elected community? But I love that comment.
Sorry, so I don't know if anybody wants to share from the business or the media group. What kind of issues came up?
Laura or Catalina, Didicus, you want to share from the business group?
Sure. I'm always good for a comment. Look, well, we were talking about DEI and how it can be used in a well-being scenario. I brought up the challenge of dealing with that so it's not cosmetic, where in a conventional corporation, the bottom line is the focus. And Laura brought up a good point that you can make it not cosmetic by showing that happier workers make bigger profits. That's an interesting concept, and I was just thinking about that. But where I've worked in the past, happier workers were the ones that were getting rewarded for doing what management wanted, and we felt like trained SEALs. Is that really a well-being point? I don't think, I would hope not. And that's why my groups are more focused on worker-owned cooperatives, where the value of being a happy worker is that you are part of the ownership, and you don't have to be told, be called an affiliate or an associate or some other cosmetic cover-up for the fact that you're a worker. As in a worker-owned cooperative, you're happy to be a worker. So that's, can everybody be a worker cooperative? I'd be happy if they were, but I don't think that that's going to happen. So that's realistically speaking.
Yeah, I mean, what I will say is there's a group of business leaders that have convened on some of the topics of well-being as part of some of the national efforts, along with entities like Just Capital and some other kind capital, social kind of socially minded investment organizations. And their argument is maybe less on your point, although a good one, and more about getting beyond just like employee wellness programs and thinking about kind of the workplace community interface as actually helping them retain the next generation of employees, thinking about multi-generationality in the workplace, because for the first time we have 5 generations under one workplace, and thinking in that way. So those have been somewhat resonant concepts in some of the business conversations that have been happening as part of some of the business leaders who are a little bit kind of more socially minded, sure, but not maybe fully where you are. So I think, your points are really well taken, but there are some folks who at least are grabbing onto these themes and concepts, and why this well-being conversation is starting to resonate more with that. Initially, it might have been worker retention and might be a little bit misguided, to your point, but now I think it's more of a generational view on the workplace. Does media want to go? I'd love to hear how the media team.
Scott, shall I put you on the spot since we didn't get to talk to you? I'm teasing, but does
It would
anybody
be
want
unfair. Besides, my perspective is external. Callie's probably in a better position given the focus of the conversation.
So is Kelly on the spot?
Callie, I know one thing you were talking about was a couple things that stood out for me was in conversations with folks in the solidarity economy, feeling frustrated that well-being is not quite radical enough. And I was talking about Anita and some of the work that we did with the grassroots organizations. We heard it in other countries and also here, like when really grassroots, more quote unquote radical voices get heard, they contribute, but then they get smoothed out so much to make something that's like more acceptable to at a large scale. And then that feels really othering. And then we end up with this thing that feels like think tanky and not from the grassroots, right? And so thinking about ways that all of those voices can plug into the conversation and push from different sides of the spectrum, I think is really interesting. And then the other thing that came up in what Callie was sharing was about power and conversations about like who has power, who could have power or needs to hold power differently. And how do we keep that conversation in the well-being conversation? And Callie was sharing some upcoming conversations about universal basic income and how a lot of this stuff comes up, like who holds power and who deserves, right? Deservingness is such a huge part of this universal basic income. And she was feeling buoyed by some recent media stories that talked about, that kind of debunked the mythology that people getting universal basic income didn't deserve it and would make bad choices with that money and all of that stuff, like stories about how that's actually not the case. And when you create universal basic income and financial stability for families, they thrive in lots of ways. And so that felt like a really positive shift in the media. Callie, I hope I'm not falsely speaking for you. I know you're not feeling great and I see you on mute, so thought I would jump in.
Just that, I mean, the really remarkable thing about those studies and that they're covering them a lot now in mainstream media is that people are actually starting to gain full-time employment and good stable housing and being able to cover childcare and doing all these things that, people just and politicians assume that people should just be able to do. But if you're in kind of like survival mode or in a psychological state of like economic trauma, for example, that you can't actually do those things. And so, the narratives are starting to change that actually it's not the people that are the problem, but it's actually the system and the way the resources are distributed and who has the power to make those decisions is and so that's a big shift in various parts of the economic transformation movement, and even within climate change, is like shifting power and resources to give the people at the bottom the power to make the decisions because they're closest to the problems, and wondering how that can be part of the well-being framework as well. And I think, like I mentioned, I think they're starting to do that a lot in Washington with the community assemblies and these listening sessions to inform well-being policy at the state level.
Right.
So we are,
and Lindsay Morgan Tracy from Washington is part of some of this collective well-being conversation that I've been talking about nationally, trying to think about how that model can be transferable to the other 49 states. So I'm glad you mentioned that.
I think a lot of people are going to have to drop off since we've hit the top of the hour, but I just want to thank you both, Jennifer and Anita, having read the report, but understanding it at a much deeper level with the presentation was really helpful. And then at yet another level, when you forced me to think by going into a breakout room and having to like actually process the information and start to like, oh wait, what could or would I do with this? So I'm really grateful for all the time and effort you put into creating the report and then coming and sharing it with us. So thank you.
Well, thanks for the time. And as we shared in some of our breakout sessions, please don't hesitate to reach out to Jennifer and myself, and certainly, pick up the guides, but also there's other work that Jennifer and I are involved in and happy to help in some of your local efforts.
Yeah, I would love to hear more about that. All right. Well, thank you for coming, everyone.
Thanks,
I'm gonna
everybody.
shut off the recording. You're welcome to stick around for a few minutes, but